I think we're all here because we share a belief that our country's public education system is vital to the health of our economy and our democracy. I'm Eli Broad, and for the last 10 years, the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation has been involved in education reform. And over that decade, it's become very clear to us and others in America that our public schools aren't working and that alternative education systems are necessary. If we go back to the 50s and 60s, America had the #1 economy in the world and was #1 in the world in public schools. When our education system started to decline the latter part of the 20th century, so did our economy, and other countries gained on both fronts. There was a recent McKinsey study that noted that if America had closed the international achievement gap in the 15 years between 1983 and 1998, and we had raised our student performance to a level of South Korea and Finland, the United States GDP in 2008 would have been between $1.3 trillion and $2.3 trillion higher. And if we close the achievement gap between African American Latino students and their white peers, our GDP would have been 310 billion to 525 billion higher, again, according to McKinsey's study. I want to note that the Obama administration and Education Secretary Arne Duncan recognized a connection between our nation's economic health and our education system. As you know, we have more than $100 billion of federal stimulus going to our public schools. And that makes an unprecedented opportunity for states and school districts to really transform into what I'd like to think would be high-performing public enterprises. In the 10 years that our foundations worked to reform public education, there are 3 different alternative education systems that have shown to us the greatest promise in improving public schools. And they're mayoral control, gubernatorial control or state control, and what we'll talk about today, charter schools. Before we get to the topic of charter schools, I want to say that many of us in education reform have taken note of the dramatic improvements in a city's public schools when the mayor has control of the system. As many of you know, in this country, we have 14,000 school districts, made up probably of an average of 7 members. And I believe if you took a survey, you'd be hard-pressed to find 10% of the population that could name 1 or 2 of those school board members. But everyone knows who the mayor is. And when he or she has control of the schools, there's a single point of accountability. We've seen this in Chicago with Richard Daley, Boston with Mayor Tom Menino, New York City with Mike Bloomberg, and most recently in Washington, D.C. with Mayor Adrian Fenty. And by the way, tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Michelle Rhee, the chancellor of the D.C. schools, will be here. Another alternative is Gubernatorial Authority, which we often see in a period of fiscal or natural crisis where the state takes over the school system. We're seeing it in New Orleans when the state assumed control of the schools after Hurricane Katrina. And now 70% of students in New Orleans attend charter schools. The third alternative education system are high-performing public charter schools, which I believe are one of the most successful models today in public education. I've been so convinced that high-performing quality charter management organizations like Green Dot, KIPP Academy, and others been so impressed that we've made a commitment totaling about $100 million to these organizations over the years. And as you know, in exchange for public funding and greater autonomy, charter schools are held to accountability for meeting goals to advance student achievement. Those that aren't successful lose or should lose their charter. Those who are successful most often run circles around their conventional neighborhood schools with similar demographics. We have 4 distinguished panelists today who are all authorities on high-quality public charter schools. With us today in alphabetical order, we have Steve Barr. Steve is the founder and chairman of Green Dot Public Schools. He created Green Dot back in 1999 to develop charter schools in Los Angeles. Today, Green Dot operates 18 public charter schools with plans to add 30 more by 2015. Some 78% of Green Dot students graduate compared with only 46% in the Los Angeles Unified School Districts. Nearly 3 out of 4 Green Dot graduates have been accepted to 4-year universities, a dramatically higher percentage than in other public schools. We're joined by Timothy Knowles, the Lewis Sebring Director of the University of Chicago's Urban Education Institute. And they run 4 charter schools. Tim is an expert on charter school reform, administration, and teacher development. Prior to heading the Institute, he was the executive director and senior research associate of the Center for Urban School Improvement at the University of Chicago. Before he moved into academia, he was a practitioner, working as deputy superintendent for teaching and learning at Boston Public Schools. Larry Rosenstock is the CEO of High Tech High, which began in the year 2000 as a single charter school launched by a coalition of San Diego business leaders and educators. High Tech High has evolved into a school development organization that has a growing portfolio of innovative charter schools spanning kindergarten through the 12th grade. After he attended law school, Larry taught for 11 years in urban schools in Boston and Cambridge. He served as staff attorney for 2 years at the Harvard Center for Law and Education, was a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a number of years, and principal of High Tech High for 6 years. We have Deborah Stipek. She's the James Quinlan Dean and Professor of Education at Stanford University School of Education, which operates the East Palo Alto Academy Charter, consisting of a school that opened in 2001 as an elementary school, as rather a high school, and in 2006, an elementary school. Before joining Stanford, Dr. Stipek was a professor at the UCLA Graduate School of Education for 23 years and was a director of the Corrine Seeds University Elementary School and the Urban Education Studies Center. Her academic areas of focus include elementary education, school reform. Dr. Stipek has been a regular policy advisor on issues relating to children and education. So please welcome our esteemed panel. Let me start with Steve Barr. She started Green Dot. Let me start with Steve Barr, who started Green Dot a decade ago to create a small, safe high school in Los Angeles. Today, Steve has created a system of new schools in Los Angeles where we're seeing reform from the bottom up, and now even teachers are great advocates for Green Dot charter schools. Steve, talk a bit about why Green Dot has been so successful and what impact you think it can have upon the LA Unified School District.
Well, charters for me are serve two purposes. One, they make a proof point. And what we tried to prove is that you could take the same dollars and the same kids in the highest need areas of Los Angeles and dramatically outperform the existing schools. And create an R&D situation that hopefully becomes the future of what a school district should look like. So from everything from just creating a charter school to creating support back office, the way you do HR, and what makes us different than most CMOs, we actually have our own teachers union. Because the idea was, if you're going to ask for systemic change in an industry that's 100% unionized, the idea that somehow you're going to change it with non-union labor, I just thought was a little bit off as my political sense. And so what I thought about was, union contracts are written in reaction to bad systems. So if you have bad urban school systems, you're going to have a reaction that's equally horrible, is what we have right now. If you address a lot of issues like teachers having a say in what goes on in front of them, having a limited amount of kids in front of them, paying them well, but asking for accountability, the reaction to that in a union contract should be thin. And so our union contract's 28 pages. So what we've created is an alternative public school system that hopefully, in time, LA Unified will look a lot like our system and eliminate the need for a charter school.
Thank you. Tim, how does what Steve is doing compare with what you're seeing in Chicago charter schools?
I think the motivation is similar. Colleagues of mine at the Urban Education Institute did a piece of stunning research that sort of galvanized Chicago now a few years ago, that suggested if you were in 9th grade in a Chicago public school, the odds that you would have a 4-year college degree by the time you were 25 were 6.5%. If you're an African American or Latino boy, 2.5%. That didn't include kids with special needs, so probably the numbers are more like 1 in 50 African American and Latino boys are getting a 4-year college degree by the time they're 25. So the motivation for creating new designs, alternatives for to create an existence proof that this is doable, this is possible, is very similar. I think one of the potential powers of the charter movement is it creates this space for innovation across the board, and so you have multiple designs which are growing in multiple places across the country. Some share some things in common. More time is something that we're seeing really matters for kids who are way behind. Really careful use of diagnostic data really matters. So not waiting for what a colleague of mine calls the autopsy reports, the reports you get at the end of the year after the kids have left you that tell you how you might have been doing, but really paying attention to each kid along the way. And the final thing I think that good schools are sharing is an orientation to this enterprise that injects in it passion for kids and teachers, and real opportunities for engagement. And that's seldom part of our discourse about schooling these days. But and I'd be happy to elaborate what I mean, but I've committed myself to 2-minute answers.
Larry, what's unique about the high-tech high model, and why aren't other public schools or public charter schools doing what high-tech is doing?
Well, I spent 20 years in big urban districts before I started doing charter schools. So when people ask whether charter schools change big districts, my first response is compared to what? Because not much really does change them. But what we do, I've been pleasantly surprised by some biomimicry by the district of trying to do schools like ours. I just hope that they're good. And if they're not good, I hope people don't think that they are ours. But we have 10 schools, and we set out, as others up here have, for college completion. That was the pot at the end of the rainbow. 33% of the kids this year who graduated in California from a high school took all the courses that they need to satisfy the A through G requirements to get into the University of California. It's the longest list of requirements of any public university system. 3 of the top 5 public universities in the United States, 3 of them are UC schools. 100% of our kids meet the A through G requirements. We have 5 high schools. 80 kids who are free and reduced lunch. That's a family that has $18,000 for a family of 4. That's the same number in Kansas as it is in Southern California. Of 40% of our kids are that. That doesn't mean the other 60% are multimillionaires by a long shot. Of the 88% that are free of the free and reduced lunch kids, 88% of them that have graduated from high-tech high have graduated from college or are still there full-time. We have a 68% admissions rate into the University of California. I think there's two things. And we also have twice the national average of kids in college who major in science, technology, engineering, and math. And that's what makes us unique, not that we told them to do that, but because we are doing it and constructivist in our pedagogy, and kids are behaving like scientists, behaving like journalists, behaving like photographers, and very much engaged and feeling, therefore, this is something I want to do later in life. And finally, we have the first new graduate school of education in some decades in California, firmly embedded within our schools, practicum-based grad school of ed.
Dr. Stipek, Stanford's recent report from the Center of Research on Education Outcomes, CREDO, looked at charter school performance in some 16 states. Tell us about the main takeaways of the study and why research is so critical to the charter movement.
You know, one of the things that surprised me about that study, which essentially said that charters varied hugely, some were very successful, some were not particularly successful. People seem surprised by that, and I wasn't at all surprised by that, because I don't know of a single education intervention that has not resulted in a situation where there is as much variation within the intervention as there is between the intervention and the status quo. There are very effective charter schools and there are very ineffective charter schools, and I would reiterate what you said, which is we should close the ineffective ones after we've given them a few years to learn how to do it right. Although I would say that we should also close the ineffective non-charter schools. I don't know why we should pick on charter schools in particular, because there are a lot of non-charter schools who are very much alike like that. I'm going to go back a moment and say something about what the role of research is. I think universities and a lot of university research has become very divorced from the real practice of education. And it's one of the reasons why Stanford actually got into the practice of education by opening a charter school. Universities are doing research, but they're not necessarily asking questions that school leaders, whether they're charter school or non-charter school, need answers to. And I'm following on the heels of what the University of Chicago did. We opened our own charter school in many respects to do all the same things that these folks are trying to accomplish, but also to hold our feet to the ground and make sure that the people in universities who are training teachers, who are training school leaders, who are asking important or asking questions that could contribute to the effectiveness of education, actually understand what the real challenges of urban education are in this country. And so the real question is not, are charter schools better or worse or the same than non-charter schools, but what is it about charter schools and what is it about non-charter schools that are successful, and how do we get schools to embody those particular qualities so that we have a broader effectiveness for education. And I think research can be a very important tool in trying to document those lessons that we're all learning by doing.
May I say something about the
Certainly.
report? Just one quick thing. If you look at the performance of traditional schools, it's shaped like a bell curve. What the CREDO report showed was that charter schools are U-shaped. So they're heavily represented at the high end and heavily represented at the low end. If, to be egalitarian about it, if we closed 10% of the lowest performing district schools and 10% of the lowest performing charter schools, charters would vastly outperform district schools, which is why we really need to close underperforming charter schools.
Well, the other thing buried in the CREDO report was, or maybe not buried, but was that it was unambiguous that the impact of charters was significant for poor kids and for English language learners. And I think for most of the people up here, or all of us, that's the point.
You know, in response to the report, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools stated the following. At the national level, charter students perform lower than non-charter students in reading and math in the first year. However, they say by the third year, national results show charter school students performed higher than non-charter school students in both subjects. Then they say at the state level, charter students perform higher than non-charter students in reading and math in only 3 out of 15 states in the first year. However, by the third year, at the state level, charter students outperform non-charter students in 11 of the 12 states in reading. Charter students outperform non-charter students in 9 of the 12 states in math and perform the same in 2 other states. Right. Do you agree with that?
Well, those are data, but I still think that we could argue data forever about whether we're really better or worse. And I really think that that's missing the point, because there are some very bad ones, and we should get rid of them. And we should learn from the good ones. And I think if we focus more on what are the lessons that charter schools can teach us, then I think we're probably going to make more progress than if we spend our time arguing about the data and who's winning the horse race.
So what drives me crazy about studies is, so they'll do a study of all the charter schools in California. So that means Green Dot is in the same sample set as the YOLO County Peace and Freedom homeschool. Nothing in common except for charter, because the law has homeschools and has urban schools. We should be compared with Jefferson High School, which drops out 70% of their kids, and Locke High School, which now retains most of their kids, but didn't used to. That's the comparables, and sometimes these broad swaths, sometimes sponsored by people who want to take down charter schools, and then there's a counter study, and then they become debate for 2 months, and it goes back and forth. But I think the Creative Report is 90%, and I'm a charter school developer, but I'm not part of the charter school cult. I want to use them to create great public schools. Right. It's Green Dot Public Schools. 90% of them are either as good or poorer than public schools, but the 10% that are out there doing it, in the vast majority of all the things that are going on in urban schools across the country, that's got to get people's attention, and we have to create the political will around it. Now, so Michelle Obama in the campaign, I think, had the best comment I've heard about public education. She said, every neighborhood in America, urban, suburban, rural, all the parents know there's that one school. That one school you get up in the middle of the night to go get in line for. You get in the lottery. Can I borrow your address? Sometimes they're charters. Sometimes they're regular public schools. Sometimes they're magnets. Sometimes they're private schools. The question is, why don't all schools look like that one school? We know what works. And that's what charters at their best create, that R&D that we should create political will around and stop studying the hell out of each other and explaining away results.
You know, there's a national debate going on whether it's the environment, other services offered to students and their families. Does that make the big difference, or is it really the school? And Dr. Roland Fryer, who heads the Education Innovation Laboratory at Harvard, did a study recently of the Harlem Children's Zone, which is renowned by many, including myself. And what he did is he looked at the students that, quote, won the lottery and went to charter schools within that district, and the same students that did, from the same area that didn't win the lottery, how did they do? And the charter school students receiving the same services did dramatically better than the other students. And that's, I think, a controlled study of the difference between students going to charter schools and other public schools in the exact same environment, coming from similar families with similar income and ethnicity. Let's move on. State policies affect the operating climate for charters. I want to ask Larry and Steve and all of you, what can be done at the federal level to improve charter operations around the country?
Okay, I just have to say a couple of quick things. Charter schools, like TFA, we tend to hire teachers who come from the top quartile of their undergraduate class, and the average teacher in the United States comes from the bottom third. So it's all about, it's really, the answer to that is really about quality of teachers. And as to the other point, I just want to say for the first year, the kids come to a brand new school in September in the first year, and they're tested in March. This is not to be defensive about it, but it's obviously there's no traction yet. That's why in the second and third year it shows. I think what the Fed should do in particular would be make a condition for any state to get federal stimulus dollars that they provide parallel access to state dollars to charter schools that they do to district schools, because they don't have that requirement, and that would be very, very helpful. I think that they should provide waivers, just the same way states provide waivers, and I also think that the public charter school grant program really needs to be reconfigured, because it's just got some stuff, in my opinion, that's really upside down and doesn't work the way it ought to be.
Dr. Stipek?
Well, facilities is a major challenge for charter schools, certainly in California, and I think in a lot of other states too. So any federal support that would support the development of facilities for charter schools would be a huge, because you end up spending so much time on facility issues that it really distracts from the other kinds of things that you need to do. The other thing, and this is not just for charter schools, but for all schools, we're all under the same accountability system, and we are all being held accountable to the same not very good tests. And to the degree that we could have really good tests that assess what we really care about and want children to know and understand, I think we will improve substantially and allow charter schools to be more innovative and more effective than they are, given the current accountability system that they're
Yeah, just to underscore that, Eisenhower did the highways, right? I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
So the DOE should do this national assessment. I'm not as persuaded as some that we can all agree on a specific set of national standards, given we have intelligent design in one place and not in others. But I think the idea of a national assessment that doesn't get gamed, we've got states in our nation that have something over 90% of their kids now achieving proficiency against the national standard because they've dropped their standard so low. That's key. I also think that there's a need to recognize, and how you do this with federal policy would be worth some discussion, but need to recognize that the charter idea is a really incomplete theory. It's got major gaps. It's basically predicated on the view that you give hiring flexibility, budgetary flexibility, governance, policy, and use of time. You get flexibility over all those things in exchange for higher levels of accountability, potential for being shut down, and parents being given the opportunity to choose these places. Nowhere in that theory lives teaching, learning, or leadership. And until we get to the technical core of this enterprise, which is the quality of teaching and learning and leadership, and build human capital systems that actually contribute to that, and tools that can help inform the practitioners about what's going on in front of them. And I think we're going to be having these silly political debates about charters or not charters, and lining up these countervailing reports.
Well, and a lot of charter success, to some degree, is because they are able to attract the brightest and the best. But it's like playing musical chairs. So essentially, to the degree that the charter school is successful in bringing in the 2 math teachers who actually know math in the community, it means they're not available to the other schools. And so instead of having a situation where we're playing musical chairs and moving people because we've created a more supportive environment for teachers in a charter school, it doesn't increase the capacity. It doesn't make it easier for other schools to find effective leaders, to find effective teachers.
But what's the R&D of that? The R&D is if you improve work conditions, you'll attract better teachers. So do we not take the good teachers because we don't want to hurt the failing school?
No,
and then those bad teachers get freaked out and leave after 2 years?
Steve, that's not my point at all. My point is sooner or later you use them up. And if you really want to create change on a large scale, you have to be building capacity so that there are more available.
You really believe there's a finite number of good teachers?
Well,
no, you have to make them.
No, you can develop them.
But you also have another trouble at the back end, because you've got tenure in districts, so there's no room for new teachers to come in, and that's a real impediment.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening now at LAUSD and many other districts. As a result of budgetary problems coupled with collective bargaining agreements that provide tenure and seniority, they're letting their youngest, probably some of their most active, shall we say, young teachers go.
Right.
But Teach for America doesn't have an opportunity as a result of these conditions to place any of their teachers in a number of school districts now. So it seems to me that if charter schools do in fact attract the best teachers, whether they're from other public schools or from Teach for America or elsewhere, that eventually, if they get a big enough market share, it will force a change in the collective bargaining agreements in those districts because the public will not tolerate a situation where charter schools are doing dramatically better than other schools. What do you think about that?
But so 2 weeks ago, we signed a contract in Green Dot in New York with the American Federation of Teachers. That's 28 pages, biggest teachers union in the country, in the world, local. Has no tenure, has just cause instead. Hiring and firing is at the school site, not through some centralized system. No minutes and hours of professional workday. And we agreed to pay 14% more on efficiency. Now, so if the teachers union, which is always the boogeyman in this thing, can come meet us midfield, where's the charter movement? So I have friends in the charter movement who walk around, they still have their laminated newspaper article, how they were wronged by that charter leader back in the 90s. They just can't let it go, okay? And we have to step our game up politically as charter leaders and get with the realization that this is now federal and public dollars now. This isn't philanthropy dollars only anymore. And so we have to play politics the way it's supposed to be played. And so if the unions are willing to reform to match our system but give some kind of protections for teachers, we have to step up a bit.
Steve?
Yeah.
I have 325 employees, and everybody from me to a custodian has the same exact contract, and it's 4 pages long. So you got to bring that.
That's
thing
great.
down in a non-union shop.
That's fantastic. So that's great in your system.
All right. Everyone has
I'm
the
talking
same
about
contract,
systemic
everyone has
change
the same-
here.
No, I'm not knocking that,
Yeah.
but I think that what you have is I really agree with Tim that the guts of the problem is that kids are not engaged in school. That's really what this is about, and I don't think the employment agreement changes that too much. But still, as Eli said, look what happened in San Diego Unified. Because of what they just did for the senior people in the union, they cut everybody who's been working there for less than 8 years. Sure. And that is called, in union speak, pulling up the ladder strategy. And so, I think, and charters have the same problem. Because charters, the fascination, charters think that all charters are good, and they're not. We're a group that think we need to really be accountable. And I think that charters can't accuse unions of protecting bad teachers as long as we protect bad charters. And I also think, having been involved in this charter thing from the beginning, that the amount of innovation on the pedagogical side is really very, very, very small within charters. I think that what charters and unions understand is like when Kipling said the strength of the wolf is in the pack and the strength of the pack is in the wolf, they both get the first part of that and they don't get the second part of that.
Tim, you followed President Obama's education policies closely. You're familiar with Secretary Duncan's work as superintendent in Chicago. Just last week, he spoke to National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, their conference, and called for charter authorizers to do a better job of holding charter schools accountable. He said the charter movement is putting itself at risk by allowing too many second and third-rate charters to exist. What do you think can be done across the board to change that situation, and who should do it?
Well, I think they are right. I think we all agree that closing failing charter schools or traditional schools or any schools, as hard as it is, and it's probably the most politically complicated thing. So we shouldn't be glib about this idea of closing schools when schools are the only institutions in communities. No matter how bad they are, no matter how fancy your PowerPoints are that suggest that the data is gone south, communities who say you're taking this this institution away and you're going to give me what? A promise of something new? It's complicated terrain. That said, it should happen across the board. I think the other accountability, the message that got lost clearly in No Child Left Behind and in terms of accountability generally for public schools is, are we measuring the right things? Yes, we care about standardized test scores going up and their growth being instrumental to the measurement of success, but what we really know is that the data that Steve and Larry talk about with regard to their schools, what we really know matters is high school persistence, finishing high school, and then being prepared to enter post-secondary education, whether it's college, 4-year, 2-year, or some other trajectory. That's what we know, and so the feds and the state governments and the locals, I think, have to get a much more robust definition of what success looks like. Otherwise, we're going to be tinkering around with these blunt instruments that we administer in an hour at the end of the school year or an hour and a half.
It seems to me that we have to get more competent charter school authorizers that have a real ability to really police charter schools and know when to close them.
Right.
By the way, I got a note saying there's feedback from BlackBerries and cell phones, so if we have them on, turn them off, please. Okay, we've seen the most successful charter schools like Green Dot, High Tech High, and KIPP really bubble up from activist teachers, parents, and the community. I want to ask, what do you think the role of universities should be in the charter school movement? Dr. Stipek?
Well, first of all, I think there is a real benefit to universities actually running their own charter school. It holds us accountable in a way that we never have been held accountable. We go around preaching, we train teachers, we train leaders, and I don't think we should be doing that unless we can actually demonstrate that what we're preaching works in our own backyard. It's been an enormously tough, but I think productive lesson for Stanford to actually do this. If nothing else, somebody asked me, what have I learned most in starting a charter school? And my response was humility, because as I have in just about everything else I've done, grossly underestimated how hard it is. And I think, and also have learned better, I think, not me, but my entire faculty, what some of the issues are that we need to be able to address when we're training teachers and others to be in schools. I think there's another important role that universities can play that can help us get out of this reinventing the wheel, which is what we do an awful lot in education. You mentioned something about we're not particularly innovative even in charter schools on the pedagogical side, on the instructional side, and I think that's absolutely right. We spend on, you're not going to be surprised that a researcher is going to make this point, but Mattel Toy Corporation spends more on development for its toys than the United States spends on research on education. We do not have a very strong knowledge base. I think all of us would say we know what works. Mostly it's from our own personal experience and observations. It's not from the research base. People are inventing over and over different assessments, different ways to promote teacher excellence, and different ways to organize schools to give teachers time and meaningful support and improve instruction and so on. If we could document that in some more systematic way, then I think we could actually see a field that's moving forward rather than a field that seems to be going around in circles. I mean, I think if you just imagine medicine with no research, every doctor inventing something new to deal with his patients, you'd see that it doesn't work very well. And so that is an important role I think universities can play.
I think
Tim and then Larry.
Okay.
I guess
chime in on this one, too.
There's this national narrative about dissatisfaction with the role that higher education plays in improving the K-12 enterprise. And I think it's a legitimate narrative. It's not the subject of this panel, but it could be. At times when I felt frustrated, I've described higher education as a cartel, sort of delivering the vast majority of the human capital to the doorstep, to the schoolhouse door, without any accountability for what happens after that. And so I think part of the answer to your question is can we use this moment where there's unbelievable national attention on this issue and some resources, at least for the short term, to say we need different designs for what higher education is and does, different models for its role in this enterprise. Larry, you've got one. I mean, you've become a higher ed institution from the schoolhouse up. I'm in a higher education institution. The University of Chicago shut its school Department of Education, much controversy, on the front page of the New York Times, and yet in the absence of it, has grown a pretty extraordinary set of interconnected activities. And so I think there's a bigger question here embedded in your question about what is the role of higher education in improving this K-12 enterprise, and what isn't it time we had different sort of charter that, right?
I think there are a couple of other roles. One, the Credo report also, it was an odd piece of data, the larger the number of authorizers of charters in the state, the lower the performance of charters in that state. And I think that what that's about, we take California, for example, the only way that you can get authorized primarily is from the school district. Imagine any industry where the only way you can get authorized is from the entity that you're competing with for revenue, right? So this doesn't make for a lot of fun moments. And if you call it a cartel, as my colleague Julian Betts, an education economist at UCSD, he calls school districts a co-monopoly of labor and management. And proving that point, Aspire Public Schools and High Tech High both got what's called a statewide benefit charter, this first new entity that let us not be authorized locally. Well, there are 9,000 schools in California, and when Aspire opened 2 and High Tech High opened 2, as co-plaintiffs, the California Teachers Association and the California School Boards Association sued the State Board of Ed, saying that they didn't have the authority. They lost the suit, but they were so threatened that 4 schools got let out. So I think that universities should be authorizers, not school districts, community colleges as well, perhaps.
So what, let me comment. I have to be a little bit of a contrarian. I'll try to be as diplomatic as I can since I'm surrounded by academia.
Don't hold back. Don't hold back.
I mean, listen, this system is so failed, public education, that the problem with universities' involvement in reform is they're not in the pissing off adult business. They're in the collaborating and making nice with all of them, to their clients. That's it's a tough reach for academia. You know, I mean, when you look at Locke High School, the school I took over in Watts, and you walk around the halls there and you think it needs to be studied or massaged, no, it needs to be closed, fired. It's going to piss off a lot of people. It's going to piss off unions. It's going to piss off school districts. You just took $26 million from them. Academia is not in the business of pissing off people. And I'm saying this thing is so, and so the problem is if you nuance it and do work in the margins, you water down the anger, and that anger simmers into apathy. And I think right now, there are exceptions. You know, Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles is a partner because they don't study a lot of things. They're in the active business, so they're a good partner. And there's some other people waking up to this fact, but it really comes down to if you're not willing to piss off a few adults, you ain't going to fix the system, and you should get out of the way.
I think there's even a more critical reason why universities should not be the authorizing agents. And that is, I don't think universities know how to run schools. And I can say that with honesty because we did not know how to run a charter school when we started it. This has been learning on the job. So I would not in any way want Stanford, as good as an education school as it is, as good as a university as it is, to be in the authorizing.
Who should the authorizer be then?
I probably want to have some sort of consortium of successful schools, of people who have shown that they know what works and what it looks like. So universities would be the last place I'd go, except places like maybe Chicago or places that have demonstrated that they have gotten out there and done it themselves.
Who are those people that know what's going to work in charters?
Well, we have a fairly decent state organization, the Charter School Association of California. I think it's unique and very, very strong. And it has come out with an effort to try to hold accountable underperforming charter schools. But as you've pointed out, as in district schools, we just got reauthorized for one of our charters at San Diego Unified, and a school went in front of us. Under state law, there are 5 criteria that you have to meet for a school district to reauthorize a charter school. 4 of them were not met, and all the families were there for the reason that Tim just said. So they're actually legally not even allowed to reauthorize, and the families were all there, and they did.
So and with help with EdVoice that you're involved with, Eli, we've sponsored some legislation about 5 years ago, SB 740, which created an advisory commission of the State Board of Education, and it was made up of charter leaders, but also union leaders, parent groups. So there was about 8 of us, and we looked at all the distance learning charters out there, these ones that were ending up in the newspaper, where a Gorman Elementary School of 53 kids could sponsor a charter for 10,000-person distance learning warehouse where people are getting rich off of it. So we went and looked through all the books of all these charters, and we closed 3 of the biggest charter organizations in the state of California, saved the taxpayers $70 million. The beginning of that idea, because we were all cultish about this idea, I got kicked out of the cult, and then we were brought back in when people actually looked under the engines of some of these nightmare organizations and that were pulling down the charter movement. Now we've led the way in that way. And I offered that up to Governor Romer when he was the superintendent. Create an advisory commission. I'll sit on it, and we'll tell you who is good and who isn't, and so you can fast-track this, and we'll take the heat.
Let's move on. Yesterday, I was impressed with the fact that the University of Chicago closed their School of Education, having an illustrious history over many decades. There are a lot of people, including myself, that believe we should not have ed schools, that everyone should start as a math major, science major, history major, ed major, at the end of their sophomore year or junior year, be convinced to go into teaching, rather than what we're getting now. What do you think about all that?
Yeah. So,
Bravo.
So when I just was on a video conference call with our authorizers for our Graduate School of Education with the California Teacher Credentialing Commission, and the first question they asked me was, why did you create this ed school? And I said, because I don't believe in teacher credentialing. They said, what? I said, I don't believe in it. So, but the No Child Left Behind Act says you have to be highly qualified. And the definition, unfortunately, is that you're either credentialed or in a credentialing program. Well, I hire a lot of people who are young who have PhDs in math and science, particularly a lot of women, young women, who have a lot of debt at 31 years old from having that. If they go to an ed school, and I've worked in a couple, 85 to 90% of what they're going to learn is going to be of no benefit to them. But it says if you're in an ed school, then you're highly qualified the first day. And these are people who they might not be good, but on paper they could teach at a university, they could teach at a parochial school, they could teach at a private school, and in a massive teacher shortage in this country, they can't teach in a public school.
You know, the Obama administration's backing up its support of charter schools with money. Not enough, but an increase of $52 million in charter school funding in the 2010 budget. Stephen Leary, how should that money be spent? And how should that investment be measured?
Give half to Larry and half to me.
Not a bad idea.
I'd find 100 more like us. And, well, I'm kidding, but sort of not.
Steve, how should it be spent?
So I think
Other
the
than
most
giving it to you.
I think the most dynamic part of the vision of what the Secretary's laid out and the President is the turning around of the lowest performing schools in the country. I can build charters every year, 2 or 3. And when I'm 60 or 70 years old, I'll have maybe 10% market share. The taking over of Locke High School and using what we know in creating a different system not only transforms that neighborhood, but what it does is it inspires. I live in an upper middle class neighborhood in Silver Lake outside of downtown Los Angeles. My neighbors now go, geez, can you do Marshall High School what you did to Locke High School? Which is a different conversation. How many charter schools can I build in commercial real estate rich Silver Lake to make a dent? So that bottom percent, and in fact, the call to action has so inspired me that I'm talking to Michelle about doing something in Washington, D.C. The idea that I would ever move out of California, this never was going to happen, but to transform a high school in Washington, D.C. with a good labor contract and give them a turnaround institute or a proof point to recreate across the country will have such a dynamic effect, so much more than charters. Now, I've got to convince my charter friends that when you get a facility and you have federal dollars behind you and you go to places where the politics are right, actually turning around a school is not as hard as creating a charter school out of dust where the politics aren't right. And you're in the real estate business and you're in the fighting politics stage. And every minute you're doing that, you're not educating kids. So that's why charter schools get such a mediocrity in some of the schools, because they're fighting politics all the time. But if the politics are aligned, the federal government's behind it, you get the facilities, and we're all lockstep as part of transforming these lowest performing schools, what an imprint we could make in the next 10 years.
Okay, and I would add to that you've got a couple of districts that are sort of teetering on insolvency in California, LA and San Diego. And the formula, the various formula that the feds have come up with basically are based on your student count from a couple of years ago. So since charters are the only growth area in public education in California, let's say San Diego Unified in the last 4 years, it lost 19% of its students, 4% of its teachers, and 0% of its central office. So charters are growing. We're all in a declining economic market. And I understand why they're doing that, because California can't even take over itself, let alone take over 2 school districts. But it's basically reinforcing a shrinking entity, and it's not helping out a growing entity. And as those districts might begin to collapse, actually there's going to be a far greater reliance on the charters that we're doing. So I think that, because what's going to happen, unfortunately, is that we're going to fall off another cliff in 24 months when that money goes away.
Wait. I would like to register a complaint. that I did not get to address the question of whether we should close schools of education. And it's not just because I lead a school of education, but I do want to go back to that question for just a moment.
I think we should, and I do lead one too, so there
Yeah,
you go.
there we go. No, actually, I am not opposed to closing most schools of education. I would at least look at the school and look at what they're doing, because I think we need to be a little bit more differentiated and less stereotypic about our views of them. But I do want to take, I think I do disagree with you on whether the answer is simply to take people who have good disciplinary backgrounds and put them in classrooms. We have tried that, and they do as well as our C+ average, grade point average, poorly trained teachers that we put in the classroom with credentials. But I think our aspiration should be higher than that. And what we really need are people who are both smart, have the disciplinary background, and have been trained to teach in effective ways. So rather than closing schools of education, I'd like to see the same entrepreneurial innovations in helping teachers become effective, both as teachers as well as strong disciplinary
So I agree, but here's
knowledge.
the problem with grad schools of ed. Like the one that I was in
I'm
Cambridge.
not even talking about grad schools of ed. They don't have to be in schools of ed at all.
So at High Tech High, we have a 180-day school year, and the teachers come for an hour every single morning before the kids come for a massive in-service, and they come for a month in August before the kids come for a massive. So it's making a distinction between massive in-service and this assumption about ed schools. So I'll get in trouble, I'm 3,000 miles away. At Harvard, teacher credentialing is literally and figuratively in the basement. And I talked to some people from Stanford the other night, it's probably similar. So you've got these two types of ed schools. I'm being simplistic about it. Mm-hmm. You've got schools like yours that do great research on cognition and all those great things that we're really learning about in Harvard as well, but don't really focus on credentialing and teacher preparation that much, in my experience. Maybe you do. And then you've got diploma mills, on the other hand, which are just really kind of very, very thin. So we really have a structural problem. But we agree on teacher preparation.
We agree. We should close the diploma mills.
Right.
I mean, Stanford actually does have an elite core of teachers where we bring in the very brightest and the best, because we are Stanford, and we do give them an incredibly intense 12 months in the classroom type of preparation, plus 3 years of supporting them after they leave. These are your super teachers. These are your teacher leaders. And that, if we did that the way they do in Singapore and Japan and some of the countries that we would love to be able to match, then we could really make some progress.
Right. I worry about the practicality of some of these ideas about closing diploma mills. I think the politics of that are dubious at best. I would argue the lever is on the other end, in the sense that we do have to figure out how to bridge past the value add, the gauging teacher effectiveness based on the extent to which the students they teach learn. If we can do that, and we can do that in robust enough ways, or even if we do it in just crude ways, your certification should be based on that. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't be based on whether you've done seat time or you've done in-service or you've done anything. It should be that we are, and if there are extraordinary, elegant programs, wherever they're embedded, that are getting teachers to do that, wonderful. We should support that diversity. But that's the lever, because our system right now is not paying attention.
So of all the things we've been discussing here today, we're not going to be closing ed schools. We're not going to be closing diploma mills. We're not going to get rid of school districts. We're not going to get rid of teachers' unions. When I first started teaching in the mid-'70s in Boston, it was all about school reform. And it's all about school reform today. And it's been all about school reform every day in between. And what we have, Bruce Alberts from the National Academy of Sciences, a former chemist, he describes it best. He shows this slide of vectors. Teachers' unions, school districts, parent association, textbook publishers, state standards, standardized tests. He said, this is what is known in chemistry as a system in perfect equilibrium. It's utterly dysfunctional, and it's extraordinarily stable.
Okay. Charter schools and many charter school organizers are criticized for being anti-union. Some are. 2 people on this stage have union contracts. Tell me what you think an ideal union contract ought to look like for charters. One says 4 pages, you said 20.
We don't have a union contract. I was a union activist in my youth, but I'm not anti-union, I'm anti-tenure.
So, you know, I was raised by a woman who was a waitress, was a foster kid for a couple of years. And there's that point in your life when you're a kid and you see your parent humiliated in front of you. It's devastating. It takes your whole life. And for me as a kid, healthcare was that issue. I saw my mom just humiliated at hospitals when I was sick. And then when I was 18, I became a Teamster. I worked at United Parcels. And I had the best health benefits that you could imagine. What did that do for me as an employee was I worked 3 times harder for that institution because I felt like I was a valued member. Now, I'm almost going to be 50 years old this year. We're of the age of, one, where unions have lost their way, where they got bashed and blamed. But I will tell you, in a human capital sector, like public education, you're going to have disagreements. Teachers need some protections. It doesn't have to be a job for life. They need some protection. Now, from a competitive standpoint, Green Dot, we attract teachers who would never work at a charter school. We attract A players who have a couple kids, maybe a mortgage. I can't go work at some at-will organization if I have a disagreement and I have too much at stake. And I can stay in this system and kind of write my ticket. But I'll go work with that Green Dot. They seem a little bit more grown-up, you know, and they actually value teachers collectively. They let them sit at the grown-up table with them when they talk about issues. I think we're also sitting in a time right now, and this is the most important part. We have a generational opportunity to remake teachers' unions right now. The people who come into the workforce now are not going to stick around for 30 years. They want to be accountable. They want to get better. But they also want to be assured that the dollars get in the classroom, they have some say in what goes on in front of them, and they're not overwhelmed with too many students. That can be put in a union contract. That's a value system that plays well with teachers and parents. And if you get teachers and parents together against the adults, you have a chance to win this thing. But I don't think you can do it fighting with one hand tied behind your back, teachers' unions through real estate issues or authorization issues. It's just, we have to all be working together on this thing for this thing to move forward. We can't do it half-assed.
Okay, what's a quick thing, because I love this guy. He's a very good friend, and ever since my law school days, I'm a very big fan of the National Labor Relations Act and what it does for people in this country.
Here it comes.
Here it comes. That's my setup.
He's my good friend.
There are 5. No, it's not about you personally. There are 5,000. Roughly, there are 5,000 charters in the United States, and there are a single-digit number of charters, maybe a few more, that are unionized. Now, what's different is this is a guy, because of his beliefs. Now, it is about you. You know, my feeling always was it's not for me in management's role to decide that it's a union. That's what labor decides. But it's telling that almost all 5,000 of those charters were populated by teachers who didn't feel that they needed to sign cards. All they need to do is get half of them plus one to do it. My other concern about something that you said is from, again, like 20 years working in districts, is that too frequently there is a conflict between the needs of children and the needs of employees. And for the duration of those 20 years, it gets invariably settled in the interest of employees. So that's the distinction between other private sector union contracts, for example, or in public sector ones, in particular public sector ones that have our precious little babies in there.
Before I open this up to questions from the audience, one last question for the panelists. We started with the question, can charter schools transform urban education? I'd like each of you to tell the audience what you think charter schools will look like a decade from now and your prediction about their success. Tim, why don't you start?
I think we're going to see a lot of them unionized. I think why? Because I don't think a lot of them have figured out the working conditions part of this equation. And I don't think you need a contract. I don't think you need to do that. And your school, our schools are representative of places where, at the heart of the matter, they're interesting places for adults to work and learn as well as children. And there's opportunities sort of in the DNA, the daily diet of the schoolhouse to make the profession a real profession. But I don't think that's the norm in most charter schools in our country, and I also think that there's a lot of charter schools that are sub-parochial school salary scale. And that opens you up if you don't think. So I think that's one thing that this next decade I think will bring. The other thing that I hope we test is there's the theory underneath it is interesting, autonomy and choice will get you results. But we haven't, except for in a very few cases, actually tried to test that in concentrated neighborhoods. So we don't really know what the effects of these kinds of schools that are trying to innovate are having on other schools, and whether they're actually prompting those other schools to change behavior. And that's an important question for us to dig into.
Larry, where will charter schools be a decade from now?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that pedagogically they will be as they are right now, 20 years in. They will regrettably have the same pedagogical practices that don't work in the school districts that surround them, with a rare exception of 5% of those schools. I would be disappointed if a lot of them did become unionized, because I have found in the charter schools that are unionized that I've looked at, not his, that basically there's less discourse about pedagogy. I know this from being on the executive committee of my own local back east for 5 years. There's no discourse about, the discourse is about the mandatory subjects of collective bargaining, wages, hours, and working conditions, and not the permissive subjects, which is basically about pedagogy and those other things. So, but enough about that. I don't think that that's going to take hold. I actually have a feeling more that unions are losing the franchise because of their behavior. What I would like to see unions do, which the NEA tried to do, I would like to see unions open their own charters. That's the role that I think that they could really play.
We helped Randy Weingarten to open 2 charter schools in Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really great.
Steve,
I tried this morning.
predict where charter schools will be 10 years from
I tried
now.
this morning.
We started, wait a minute, 17 years ago, there was 1 charter school in America. We're now close to 5,000.
Right.
Where are we going to be quantity and quality-wise 10 years from now?
Yeah. And more importantly, 10 years ago, I didn't know what the word pedagogy meant. So,
What does it mean?
I didn't. So, this, and I think it kind of captures a little bit what Larry. I tried this last night over 2 glasses of wine, which in Aspen is like 20 glasses of wine. So I live in a city that's got 2 basketball teams. One is the Lakers. They have been as great as long as I've been a basketball fan. They have great ownership. They picked the best general manager to lead the organization and the best coach, which I think translates well to a mayor, a superintendent, and a principal. They can take a mediocre player or a journeyman player like Trevor Ariza and make him a star. They can take a first-year rookie and match him up and have him mentored by a Hall of Famer, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, with Andrew Bynum. Now, I also live in a town that's got the Clippers. They've been as bad as long as the Lakers have been good. Do I blame Baron Davis for that, the point guard, or the Players Association Union for that? Do I just go right down to the weeds and start picking at the middle part of it and let Donald Sterling and the leadership of the organization off the hook? But the problem is this debate always goes right to the weeds, into our tribes, pointing fingers at each other, and we let off leadership. When was the last time we heard a politician say, I want to create the best public school system in America? Now, I'm a product of Pat Brown's vision in California. I jumped a class when we used to have the best public schools. Barack Obama is the first one I've heard in a long time who doesn't throw a couple of glib lines in and pivots off of it and goes to global warming as fast as you can when the issue comes up. Puts $100 billion out there and puts it out there. What we've got to do is we've got to have Laker expectations, not Clipper expectations, to rally around this idea. And we have to stop pointing fingers at teachers' unions and charter groups and this crowd and say, let's rally around the leadership. And it's been very consistent since he's been elected. I mean, fire bad teachers, close bad charter schools. But let's have the best. Let's scale up what works. Let's rally around that. And that's why I'm going to go turn around to school in Washington, D.C. and challenge the rest of these charter folks to do it. And stop whining about unions.
Dr. Stipek, where are we going to be in 10 years? That hasn't been quite answered yet.
Well, we've had some hints. I think that there will probably be more, because I think there will be increased dissatisfaction with the alternative public school systems that people have. There will be the fact that in one's own community there are highly successful schools right down the street should influence some parents to start putting some pressure and looking for more alternatives, which will give rise to an increasing number of charter schools. I think they will not, I agree with Larry, be sites of huge innovation in instruction. There will be structural innovations in some regards, but not in instruction. And I actually hold the nature of our tests and the accountability system as the primary limitation in innovation instruction, because as long as you are assessed given with multiple choice tests, you're going to get multiple choice kinds of teaching. And so until we fundamentally change what our tests are, we're going to, in any school that's being held accountable, get what we're testing, I think is what Margaret Spelling said this morning. But I think the important thing is that for those who are charter school fanatics, it is not the answer. It is not a panacea. It is an opportunity for innovation. It is an opportunity to show what we can do. It is an opportunity to influence people's views of what children can learn. But until the public, I mean really demands improvements in education broadly, not just the few that are looking for the best school in their community happens, until we raise the status of teaching in the United States, so that I don't hear from Stanford undergraduates over and over, I'd really like to be a teacher, but my parents will kill me if I waste my Stanford education on being a teacher. That is the belief, that is the status of teaching in here, and this is why we get C-average students going into teaching. And until we fundamentally change the profession of teaching. So it is a profession. Right now it is a trade where people come in, they stay flat, and if they want to do something different or grow in their profession, they have to become a principal. That doesn't work. It doesn't work in any other profession, and it doesn't attract the best and the brightest. And until we fundamentally restructure school finance, and until we fundamentally restructure the way we do schooling so that this 9-month, 9 to 3, 50-minute-hour notion of how schools are organized is thrown out, and we figure out how children really learn and what's effective. All of those things are important, and many others. So I worry sometimes when people see charter schools or class size or anything else that has been thrown out as a solution, as the solution. They don't get the complexity of the problem.
Thank you. Questions from the audience. Please state your name and affiliation.
Yeah,
Let's start here.
I'm Michael Lomax, president of the United Negro College Fund, and a member of the board of KIP and Teach for America. Benjamin Mays used to say that young men may die, old men must. Eventually, old teachers will be replaced with new teachers. And charters and Teach for America are attracting to classrooms passionate college graduates who come from the tops of their classes. Rather than seeing this as positive, I hear too many schools of ed criticizing these young people as dilettantes. Stanford professor Linda Darling-Hammond has been one of the harshest critics of Teach for America core members. So I'd like to ask Dean Stipek, do you share this point of view? And if you do, how do you think that's going to help us get the best and the brightest to go into America's classrooms?
One thing about academia is we strongly believe in academic freedom. And my faculty speak for themselves. They do not speak for Stanford. They do not speak for the School of Education. And they certainly do not speak for me. So I hold my own personal views. I do not entirely share Linda Darling-Hammond's views. I think you need to think of those as her views, not as Schools of Education's views.
What are your views?
My personal views, I think Teach for America has made a major contribution to the field of education by bringing in bright, deeply committed people into the field of education. Many of those people will, whether they are teachers or not, they will be the kind of people who are going to push innovation and change, the kind that we've talked about. So its contribution is great. Is it a solution to better instruction in classrooms? No, I don't think it is. I think what better instruction in classrooms is going to take is both the best and the brightest and some very careful training. I don't care whether it's pre-service or in-service or after service. I mean, it's got to be, however it's done, being smart doesn't mean being a good teacher. And if you look at the horse race studies, you get Linda Darling-Hammond, who reviews the literature on the credential versus Teach for America or the alternative pathways, and comes to the conclusion that the data clearly showed that credentials are better. And then you get someone else on the other side who comes to the opposite conclusion on the exact same data. If you look at those differences, we're talking about 17% of kids getting above basic versus 15% getting above basic. This is not what we aspire to. So this debate about credentials versus Teach for America or alternative pathways, I think is really missing the point. The point is, what does it take to have really effective teachers? And neither is the entire solution.
Thank you. Let's have a question over here to my
You
left.
want a success story? I'm going to give you a success story. And it involves the Aspen Institute. The 2009 Bezos Scholar is from the Preuss School in San Diego. And this is the 10th anniversary of the Preuss School. And I wanted to give you quickly a quick background. Newsweek has given the Preuss School the number 10 of the 6% highest of public schools in the United States. Quickly, the Preuss School is jointly chartered by the San Diego Unified School District. The Preuss School students are culturally diverse. They apply through a lottery. To be eligible, they have to be recommended by their teachers. The Preuss School is housed in a $14 million facility on the UCSD, University of California, San Diego campus, and it is funded entirely by community donors. I'm going to give you a very quick background because I was involved in this.
Okay.
14 years ago, as the vice president of the University of California, UCSD Foundation Board, I met with Cecil Lytle, who was provost at the time, and they really want, excuse me? Well,
Is there a question to the panel?
Where's Frank Geary?
All right, I'm sorry. I want to ask all of you, this is a successful university school. How many other schools out of university are as successful?
I just want to say one thing about that, and it's just not. I think the Preuss School. I love the school. And Cecil's a terrific person. I was involved when I first moved to San Diego as well. The Newsweek rankings are a sham. They're a rank sham. I mean, I was quoted when they did the first rankings 2 years ago. I was quoted in the second paragraph as to what makes a good high school, and people said, "Oh, you must be one of the top 100." No, we're a perfect zero because we don't have AP courses for several reasons. Most of the scientists I know don't like AP courses, accomplished scientists, because they make kids not interested in practicing science. That's why we have twice the level of kids who are majoring in math and science. And so what the Newsweek ranking does is it looks at the percent of kids taking AP classes. It is absolutely ridiculous. So what's happened since is that all these schools are calling stuff that's AP that's not AP, which has annoyed AP teachers. The whole thing is just a complete sham. And that's what happens when you have magazines that are on the ropes and they decide to start ranking to get off the rope.
You know what's really good is U.S. World and News Report.
Well,
That's a great one. That's three of my schools in their top 100.
They followed them. It's just a shame. It's really a shame because it affects. It has a deleterious effect on pedagogy in schools by people that want to chase a ranking like that. That's why it annoys me.
Dr. Chamoux, who's president of Caltech.
Yes, and I'm not part of the cartel. I don't have a school of education. I would like to come back to the question raised by Eli on science teaching. In this country, I believe the large majority of the teachers teaching science have not received a degree in physics or in chemistry or in math, as opposed to the reverse in most Asian countries and in Western Europe, where the large majority of the people teaching science have received a strong education in science. I think it makes a difference, and I would like to get your input on that. And then I have very specific questions. Every year, Caltech graduates some outstanding scientists, and to be surprised, quite a number of them want to go into teaching. And we are able to place them into private schools. We can never place them into the public system. Why is that?
If I could. So when you start high schools in areas that are so behind, we're in the undoing 8 years of neglect business in ninth grade. And we found out pretty quickly that we can teach kids to read and get up the reading level the first year. Undoing 8 years of neglect in math and science is nearly impossible. But we started a school, Animo Pat Brown. It was founded by 7 former TFA members at Locke High School. And they came to us and they said, we tested the kids coming in, they're at 1% proficiency coming into this high school near Jefferson High School. And so we want to try some radical things. Okay, what do you want to do? Well, we want to integrate math in every subject. Great. Fantastic. What else do you want to do? We want to scrap ninth grade biology and go right to physics. Well, that's a radical idea. You're going to get a hit first year on your test scores, but we're not test score crazy, but go ahead. Nothing else seems to be working. So every time I drive up to this school on Adams, it was in the Cecil Murray Center, a horrible facility, but the science teacher didn't even use the classroom. There would always be 30 kids standing out in front of the school with goggles, stopwatches, clipboards. They're always blowing up shit in the air. It's coming down in parachutes. They're cheering and screaming, and they're applying physics. 60% of physics is algebra, right? So that first year, they went from 1% proficiency to 48% proficiency in the first year. Nobody's ever done that in the country, and it became like the top ELL dominant school in math and science. Now it becomes the best practice for Green Dot. The problem is also that's a great teacher that's also applying this thing. But all of those kids who come to that thing, they're going to be, you go to that school, they could care less about politics. They care about science. They're a science-obsessed group. But the big part of that story is that's also part of union contracts and what teachers want. The ability to do something different and have somebody trust them to apply their thing and not have a one-size-fits-all. A school district would have never let them do that. Never let them do that.
We have time for one more question.
Putting me on the spot. I'm not sure this is the best use of the last question, but my question is for actually you, Mr. Broad, and Steve. And the question is, several years ago we used to hear a lot about the ideas of for-profit K through for-profit charter schools K through 12. And I was just curious if either of you would comment, is that just clearly a broken model at this point and we've sort of learned our lessons and moved on from that, or is that still a possible business model? Thank you.
We at our foundation have never been an advocate of for-profit charter schools. There are many people that are. I don't know what.
I don't know how you can run schools at a profit, frankly. I think that there's two types of schools, not-profit and not-for-profit. They're not-for-profit and involuntary not-for-profit.
Yeah, so I remember Edison, when I first was starting, so I looked at the Edison model in California. It doesn't work in California because to break even point in their model was 800 kids in a high school, which I think after 500 you start diluting the effect. I think everybody who's done research will tell you that. But they're not going to stop at 800. They're going to go to 1,200. So you're going to have a diluted product. Yes, it'll look nice and it'll be painted, but you're not going to get results. Now, could you get a for-profit venture going in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, probably. But I'll tell you one thing I've done is I've offered Chris Whittle many times. I'll pay for the billboard to put across LAUSD that says, Whittle is coming, Edison is coming, the vouchers are coming, and then moderate me and make me look like a more acceptable alternative as a charter school operator.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment? This will continue tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock at Greenwald because we have something called Transforming the System, an interview with Michelle Rhee. And if you think fireworks tonight were something, wait till tomorrow. At any rate, I want to thank our panel. Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank the audience.